Hello everyone, this is Darion GNB here, and welcome to another entry in our journey through the Nightmare franchise. Starting things off with Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Wes Craven's New Nightmare was released in 1994 and is directed by, of course, Wes Craven. The film centers around Heather Langenkamp, the actress for Nancy in A Nightmare on Elm Street, fighting to protect her son from an ancient evil, who takes on the form of none other than Freddy Krueger, and plans to cross over into our world. This is one of the films in the franchise I remember watching all the way through, and it's safe to say that I think this movie was a frickin' blast. It's not perfect, as I'll get into shortly, but it just feels so damn good to be out of the trenches of the last three films. I'm gonna be honest, when it came to writing the script for the last video, I didn't even have the energy to complete it, just because of how bad that whole batch of movies was. But New Nightmare takes a drastic departure from the previous films by notably having it take place in the real world, completely ditching the OG series continuity in favor of a more meta-driven narrative, and honestly, I can't help but dig it. This movie, everything from down to its inception, screamed ambition on Craven's part, and it's safe to say he delivered a pretty solid-ass flick. The story is really intriguing. It plays around with so many different themes, taking us on a deep dive throughout the Nightmare series, seeing what they and stories in general mean to people. It provides a bunch of cute little bits of fan service that doesn't feel super shoehorned or forced. Towards the final act, they really start to do this thing where they blur the line between the fictional world of the Nightmare films and the real world it's set in, and it's so fascinating to watch unfold. The entire movie just feels so unique and to itself. I think this was just a very cool and interesting way to take the series after all the stuff that's come before. It's a movie that manages to perfectly stand on its own 2 feet, but still manages to have a proper place in the Nightmare franchise. Something I might try at some point down the line is to watch the original and New Nightmare back to back, because while it does stand on its own perfectly fine, and there is a benefit of you watching all these films leading up to this one, I think it also works really well as kind of a direct follow-up to that original film, almost like a requel in a sense. The movie pulls in a lot of cues and Easter eggs that relate back to that OG film specifically, and I don't know if this was done intentionally, but I love the idea of hopping into this one immediately after the first. Seeing what the success of that movie led to, and seeing all the actors play themselves, I don't know, it's just really fun. The tone is much more subdued than the previous installments. This movie has a very personal feel to it, and for this movie that means a lot of different things. Between the versions of herself Langenkamp plays, and the way the story ties around to the relationship she has with her son. But it also feels very personal to a lot of the other actors who make an appearance here, including Craven himself. It's the way this movie decides to dive into all of these guys and their place within the franchise, or even amongst each other. And it's really interesting because I know these guys we're watching on screen at the end of the day are just characters, but I think this movie still does a great job at buying you into these relationships, these connections all these guys have with each other. It's really cool. This is also the first film in a while to be all about the scares. This movie does have its fair share of goofy moments, but most are saved for the third act, and most of it was pretty tasteful, I feel. But it is such a breath of fresh air compared to the wall-to-wall comedy fest the last couple films were. There's just this overwhelmingly eerie and dreadful presence in so many scenes that don't hit the same as some of the other ones like the original and Dream Warriors. And I think it's because the film, after a while, starts to dip its toes into some kind of Lovecraftian territory. That's really the only thing off the top of my head that comes to mind that I'm able to compare it to, so sorry if it's not entirely accurate. But what I mean is that, like I mentioned earlier, it blurs the line between fiction and reality, and plays into some really fascinating otherworldly stuff that mainly pertains to Freddy, or the entity that's taken on Freddy's form. And I guess I compare it to something akin to Lovecraftian creatures is because it invites that sense of intrigue and fascination of ideas and concepts that trump basic human understanding. The movie tackles a lot of trippy, metaphysical, and allegorical themes and stuff that feels both intriguing, but also feels a bit like parody. Maybe it's my scream brain that's interpreting it this way, and so much of this movie making light commentary on horror films and the film industry as a whole, but the way Craven frames the narrative with the script he's writing in the movie, being a sort of manifestation or allegory for Heather Langenkamp's life is fascinating, but because of how it's executed within the story, a part of me can't tell whether or not it's something deep the audience is meant to be fully enthralled and moved by, or if it's just meant to be a cheeky little thing that pokes fun at those kinds of stories. Knowing the kind of movies Craven goes on to do with Scream, and this movie itself, I'm almost confident in saying it's the former rather than the latter. Either way, it was still a fascinating thing to watch unfold as the story went along. As far as some of my negatives for the film, one thing that did stand out to me is the pacing. Now, the pacing of this movie, for the most part, I really do like. It is a very slow and methodical film that does a great job at getting you invested in some of the characters, the ideas, and the world it's set in being established fairly well. But I think it was around the second act where I really started to feel the length. The movie isn't even that long. It's 16 minutes longer than Dream Warriors, which before this one was the longest Nightmare film. But after a while, the length does become pretty noticeable, and I think the reason for that is because compared to the other ones, there is not that much going on as far as kills and gore and stuff. That's not a major point of this movie. Despite being a slasher, it's more concerned with all the previous stuff I mentioned. And for me personally, I don't dislike them wanting to lean away from all the gory mayhem for the sake of a really interesting story, but I think it's the lack of that that kind of causes the film to feel like it goes on for a bit longer than it has to. If we're looking at it on its own, I don't think it's that big of a deal, but for a Nightmare sequel, it is something I found to be pretty noticeable. The characters in this movie honestly are kind of a mixed bag for me. Now, nobody in this movie is terrible or one note, but not many have as many interesting things going on like our main lead. I thought Dylan's babysitter Dylan was... What? I thought Dylan's babysitter Julie was pretty sweet.
And on today's installment of Why You Should Never Take Your Job Too Seriously, we have our dear Julie. She stopped by the hospital to see how the kid was after a weird dream she had. And this one act led to her ultimate demise. Like, yeah, it's sweet she wanted to look after the kid, but she wasn't even getting paid to be there. She got torn apart by some supernatural metaphysical entity, all for the price of being a good Samaritan.
But yeah, I thought she was sweet. She had a cute dynamic with Dylan and was just alright. Dr. Hefner, the main doctor looking after Heather's son Dylan in the movie, I really enjoyed. She plays a sort of antagonistic role alongside the likes of the entity, where you see her ever-growing suspicion of Heather and whether she's fit to raise her son. I think she's a better version of this archetype than the bitchy doctor lady in Dream Warriors. Not that that character was badly written, but Hefner here clearly is wanting what's best for Heather and Dylan, but it's with Heather's paranoia and frantic nature growing exponentially that she attempts to take more extreme measures. She's not an amazing breakout character, but one I enjoyed. I'm actually going to save Heather herself for last and start talking about Freddy. Holy fucking shit, I loved Freddy in this movie. This movie treats Fred like the ghoulish boogeyman he's supposed to be. We're back to a more subdued and scary Freddy, like in the original film, before the franchise started turning his personality and mannerisms up. And it works so damn well here. I feel like for a story that is attempting to go super metaphorical in a lot of its ideas and concepts, I think a more toned down and scary Freddy was the right way to go. When he first appears in full, I'm telling you, this shit hit like crack.
It's me.
For the first time in a while, Freddy is back to his old scary self, and it feels so damn good. That's not to say this Freddy is always no nonsense in this movie. He still does have a few one-liners here and there, but it's not meant to be so ha-ha funny, and more just meant to make you feel unnerved and unsettled, which I think was pulled off effectively.
Hey Dylan, ever played Skin the Cat?
Alright, I need y'all to please tell me I'm not the only one who, when they first heard that, thought Freddy was gonna make Julie short a pair of lips, if you know what I'm saying.
In the climax, they do have some more goofier looking set pieces with him, but it never really takes away from the fearful energy the character is supposed to have. The interesting thing about Krueger in this movie is that it's not actually Krueger, it's just something taking on his form. You've probably noticed by now how I keep referring to it as the entity, and this is part of what really fascinates me about this whole movie. The entity in this movie is a being that existed a long time ago and can be bound within stories. It was within the Nightmare franchise that it was bound for a while, taking the form of the horror icon Freddy Krueger. After the films came to a close, however, it started to want to cross over into our reality. And I love all of this shit so goddamn much. It's a really interesting route to take with the character, and one that I think works brilliantly within the rest of the franchise. Craven clearly was ambitious when it came to that original film and the Krueger character, and I love how that same level of ambition carries over with all of these really interesting concepts. It just makes my mind wander and think in a way that no other previous entry in the series has done. The past films were all pretty straight to the point, but here this angle of beings taking on life through stories is just so damn interesting to me. Another thing I love about this Freddy is the design. This is easily Freddy's best look for me, hands down. I love the brighter colors and contrast it has with the dark trench coat. Hell, the trench coat itself might be the best part for me. It just fits Fred's whole vibe so well, and works to make him look even more intimidating. Which, fun fact for those who probably don't know, the whole reason Craven came up with the idea of Krueger was when he was a kid, he was looking out his window late at night, and he saw some dude taking a walk. Craven saw the dude, and the guy looked directly up at him, while Craven was watching from his bedroom window. And it scared the shit out of him, but I'm bringing this up because this specific look for Fred in this movie is supposed to be more aligned with what Craven saw the dude wearing that night. And that just makes me love the design even more. It's almost as if this is meant to be Krueger's true form in a sense. I love it. The makeup effects also look way better than what we had in the previous films. He just looks so much meaner and nastier. It looks sick as hell. And I absolutely adore what they did with the claws in this one. Instead of it being a glove with knives attached to it, the blades just naturally protrude out of his hand. It reminds me of how they'd look in some of the posters. It looks really cool. As far as my negatives with Freddy, there's only one, and if I'm being honest, it's more of a nitpick than a full-on negative. And it's that he's not really in the movie all that much. We don't see Freddy in full till about an hour into the movie. Now, considering the story it's going for and what they're attempting here, I can forgive it, but coming off of all the previous movies, his presence, or lack thereof, is something I find to be a tad disappointing, especially with how sick the design is. But the star of the whole movie has to be Heather Langenkamp. I don't think this movie would have been anywhere near as enjoyable if she wasn't in it. Firstly, I love how they made up whatever excuse they could just to get Langenkamp to face off with Freddy one last time. Even if she's not playing Nancy in this one, she still kicks ass. This is easily her most touching performance out of the entire franchise. The relationship she has with Dylan is so heartwarming, and it was sweet to literally see her go through hell and back for her kid. I am not lying when I say this movie wouldn't have been as fun without her. With Freddy not having as big of a presence as he does in some of the other films, most of the movie does fall onto Heather. And it's safe to say she did a phenomenal job. And while I'm at it, the performances for this movie were all decent. There wasn't anybody that was bad or phoning it in, but considering how much Heather and Robert do in the movie, some of the other folks didn't match up as much as those two for me personally. That's not to say everybody besides them was bad. I thought John Saxon was great. The dynamic he had with Heather Langenkamp throughout the movie was really sweet. And Miko Hughes did a decent job as Dylan despite how young he was. Fran Bennett was pretty good as Dr. Hefner, and even Craven playing himself I didn't think was too bad. England absolutely kills it, not only as himself, but as Freddy too. And I love how in the movie he's able to flex both sides of the character naturally. The main Freddy is all scary and shit, but there is one scene of him doing the more showman-like Freddy for a crowd of Nightmare fans, and it was pretty cool. The kills for this movie are honestly on a bit of the weaker side. I think this is one of the movies that is the least amount of kills compared to some of the other ones. And the ones in here are fine, I guess. Some of the deaths don't even happen on screen, that's one thing that annoys me. But a lot of them are just kind of basic stabbings and stuff. The first big Freddy kill in the movie is a homage to Tina's death from the original. Which is fun and all, but come on, I think I would have preferred something a bit more original for Freddy's first big kill of the movie. The overall practical effects I thought looked fantastic. I already talked about the makeup on Freddy looking pretty good. All the kills as well look pretty good, even if a bit basic. But my favorite effect definitely has to be the one in the climax, with Freddy trying to eat Dylan and his head is starting to stretch out and become more monstrous. It looks sick as hell. I didn't even think Freddy's death with the dated CGI looked all that terrible either. Overall, Wes Craven's New Nightmare is a solid-ass movie. It's a brilliantly ambitious route to take the series, and like I said, I think Craven really pulled it off. It plays around with a lot of abstract ideas very well, allowing for some much-needed creativity to be brought to the overall mythos of the series. I adored the stuff having to do with the entity, and I really enjoyed the kind of surreal trip through reality this movie decides to take. It as well has incredible performances that are mainly from our great main lead, and does a good job at keeping a high feeling of suspense throughout the runtime. There are a few flaws with it being light on the gore and mayhem, and the runtime feeling like it goes on for a bit long in places, but none of that really distracts from how enjoyable it was. This is a movie that you're gonna have to see to believe, because I don't think me yapping your ears off about the shit will do it justice. Craven's New Nightmare was a damn good time. Now, on to the reboot. The Nightmare on Elm Street reboot released in April of 2010 and was directed by Samuel Bayer. The film centers around high school kids brutally dying in their sleep at the hands of a being who bears finger knives and horribly burnt skin named Fred Krueger. But unbeknownst to them, he has a very specific tie to each and every one of their pasts. This movie is another one in the franchise that I know for a fact I've watched all the way through, and it's unfortunate because this movie kinda sucks. The story for the most part is the same as the original, but with a few minor twists and changes that don't really work in the film's favor. So much of what is done here, from the characters, certain set pieces, lore, etc., is just such an immense step down from the original film in my eyes. The story takes a certain direction when it comes to telling the story of Krueger with these kids that I can respect them for, but I also think it's one of the things that kind of bites them in the ass a bit. One of the things I've seen as a big point of contention for this movie is the pedophilic aspect of it. They lean heavily into the child molester angle for Freddy in this story, and like I said, in some ways it works and in other ways it doesn't. When taking a look at the movie as its own thing and not a remake of the original film, I think it works fine enough. I said I can respect them going in this direction because it just makes Krueger that much more creepy and unsettling. Framing so many of these kills and scenes of him tormenting the kids as him coming back for his victims he assaulted long ago goes a long way to make this Krueger scarier.
And there's another thing I wanted to mention before I move on, and it's to do with how certain fans perceive this whole thing. For a while, I've seen people cite this movie as the reason people claim the OG series Freddy as a pedophile. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because so many people like to cite this as a misconception that was spurred upon by the remake, when it's really not. Even in the OG series, with Craven scrubbing out all those elements of that original film, in that movie and even some of the sequels, Freddy still has a consistent pervy quality to his personality. The way he gets touchy with some of his victims, that freaky ass tongue thing he does every once in a while. Not to mention, one of the kills he pulls is literally him kissing an underage girl, without her consent, mind you, until she freaking suffocates to death. With all of that in mind, I don't think kid diddling was ever established to not be on the table for this guy. The problem I have with the remake, however, is how much they lean on the pedophile stuff and how it starts to affect Freddy's character.
Going in this direction of making Freddy a child molester and scrapping all the stuff having to do with him killing the kids takes more away from the Freddy character than it adds. For this movie on its own, I think it works fine, but when looking at it as a part of the overall franchise, it just doesn't entirely work for me. This kind of thing primarily works through implication and subtext. I won't say it's the only way it can work, because there's definitely a way that this film's approach can work if done correctly, but I say it primarily works through implication because the way it was done here just kind of makes Freddy a little less fun to watch. I don't know about y'all, but if something like Dream Warriors leaned heavy into the pedophilic aspect like this movie does, and then you get scenes like the primetime kill, that just looks really cool, and the one-liner from Freddy is pretty funny. It'd be a little distracting if I was constantly being hit over the head with the idea that the person he's killing right here, he presumably did the private parts of when they were a toddler. It just clashes with some of the other fun aspects of Freddy's whole persona, at least for me, and it's just one of the things holding me back from loving this version of Freddy. But I'll go more into that later. The tone for this movie was pretty solidly handled. It's just straight horror through and through, with nothing that takes too much away from that vibe. The writing in this movie is all over the goddamn place. The dialogue often feels so hammy and cheesy, and considering the amount of horror I watch, especially over the last couple of weeks of me watching these films, that's not new to me. But the difference here is that A, this came out in the 2010s, where having kind of cheesy lines of dialogue doesn't work as naturally for horror films. B, sometimes it clashes with the tone that the movie set for itself and it just takes me out a little bit. And C, the actors make so many of the exchanges feel so stilted and awkward.
And then it says that after that your brain will shut down, inducing a coma. Just permanent sleep.
Yeah, jackass, I know what a coma is. I'll go more into the performances later, but it also feels like the movie often doesn't know what it wants to do. Sometimes it also just feels like it's tripping over itself to kind of just have things happen. Why the fuck did Nancy think it was a good idea to sleep in a goddamn bathtub? That reminds me, something this movie loves to do is pay homage to the original film. Now on the surface, that's not such a bad thing, but it's how often they do it that kind of annoys me. It just feels super cheap to have things from an infinitely better movie shoved in my face every 10 minutes. If I wanted to see a best hits highlight reel of all the cool moments from the original film, I'd either A, watch the shit on YouTube, or B, just watch the fucking original. 9 times out of 10, the scenes are just carbon copies of what was done before, and they were better done, so you might as well just do that. Something else that really holds this movie back are some of the scares themselves. Now, I think this movie has a decent handle on suspense. Whenever we get Freddy fucking around with his victims, it is pretty unnerving. Unfortunately, the movie holds itself back by using some of the cheapest tricks to get a reaction from the audience. A key example being its usage of jump scares. Now, I'm not against jump scares in horror movies. I think they can be pretty effective. And for me personally, it doesn't take that much to make me jump. The problem with the jump scares in this film, however, is how many there are, and they just feel super cheap and lame. Instead of allowing the tension to properly build itself up in some of these scares, they instead think having a loud-ass noise will get the job done. And I know folks will probably say that if the audience jumped or got scared, then the job is done. But to me personally, I don't think it is. In other horror films, even ones in this series, they allow for tension and suspense to build properly, and allow the natural horrific atmosphere to bring forth the scare, as opposed to just having a loud noise randomly go off in someone's ear. Most people are gonna jump at that shit, which is why it's more impressive if you're able to naturally build that tension, rather than just doing something like... It's a testament to other horror films, and even ones like the OG Nightmare, that can still give me that eerie and creepy vibe, despite having watched it many times by now. Once you've seen this movie once, you've basically experienced all of what it has to offer in terms of scares, and it's not really that impressive. I think the jump scare in the library might be the one that annoys me the most because it kind of highlights most of what I'm talking about. You got a dude who sees this strange little girl staring at him. He walks over to her suspiciously. Then a horrible looking PNG of Freddy shifts over with a loud ass noise. The film is just riddled with super cheap and lame jump scares like that, and it really bogs down the movie for me. Another thing with that is the dream sequences and how they were handled in this movie. Now, this is a bit of a double-edged sword because the movie establishes a new set of rules. They work micronaps into the story, where if the brain is awake long enough, it will just shut down for a few seconds as a way to recharge itself. Basically, it has the characters briefly drift off into the dream world when they're awake. And this is a pretty cool idea, honestly, and it was handled pretty well throughout the movie. The problem with that, though, is that the movie decides to throw in a bunch of nightmare sequences in a relatively quick succession, and it just loses a lot of the creativity that they were handled with in the original. Like, one of the main things that was interesting about how they handled the dream shit is how seamlessly they transitioned someone from the real world into the dream one, and you wouldn't know until you see the crazy shit go down. And then it just continuously amps up until Freddy pops up, or you're in the boiler room, or some other shit like that. In here, it almost feels like they wanted to hold the audience's hands by giving little visual signals and cues to signify that it's a nightmare. Now, on its own, it's just kinda whatever, but it just feels like such a step down compared to how the original handled it. The characters suck butt. No, seriously, there isn't a single goddamn character in this movie that I like. Not even Nancy. Yeah, one of the best final girls out there, reduced to a bland shell of a character. She's not that interesting, she doesn't have any of that natural charisma, or show that kind of determination that can get you to root for her. None of that. Just a nothing burger of a character. So much so that before this rewatch, I fucking forgot she was in the movie at all. This is probably my third time watching the movie after God knows how long, and I completely fucking forgot Nancy was even a part of this movie. That's how little she stands out here. Something else I find so goddamn funny about this movie is that every character here other than Nancy got a name change, but their roles are exactly the same as the characters from the original. You got Chris, who's supposed to be our Tina for the film, Jesse, who's meant to be our Ron, Kyle Gallner's character is, I guess, meant to be Glenn, etc. It just makes me wonder, like, if you were going to keep their roles the exact same, what was the point of changing their names? This group of characters is so unbearably bland and boring. The movie doesn't dedicate any amount of natural time for you to forge any kind of connection with them, to where you want to root for these guys to survive. The only one we get close to is Chris, the Tina replacement, but even then, it's still done in a manner that feels a bit rushed and unnatural. It's a shame because even the original film didn't have that many interesting characters, so this movie could have done a lot with fleshing these guys out some more, but I guess fucking not. The movie does such a poor job at establishing all these guys and fleshing them out. I forgot that Kyle Gallner's character was meant to be in love with Nancy, because it's something that barely comes back around in any interesting way. And as for Krueger, I wasn't really a fan of him either. I already told you them leaning into the pedo angle, as hard as they do, really takes a bit away from the character. But the way he's written and the dialogue is executed doesn't do him any favors either. The one-liners don't come off as sinister as I think they intend to some of the time. And there's just a certain charm that feels a bit lost with this Freddy. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the performances because that's where most of my problems lie. Krueger is played this time by Jackie Earle Haley, and while he's not doing a bad job at all, there's a certain something that Englund brought to the table that he unfortunately wasn't able to capture. Actually, I think I know what it is. There's two things that hold this Freddy back for me. It's the makeup and the voice. The voice of Krueger is just as iconic as his burnt mug. What Englund did with the voice will always be iconic. But Haley's approach here just doesn't strike the same chord for me. He sounds like someone who's trying a bit too hard to sound creepy and threatening, but it just comes off as sounding kinda gross and weird. And sometimes it works.
You're my number one. You're my little Nancy.
And other times it doesn't.
I was just patting him. That after the heart stops beating, the brain keeps functioning for well over 7 minutes. We got 6 more minutes to play. Nice try, Nancy. Now let me take a stab.
And it's kind of that back and forth that makes me not too fond of this Freddy performance. And the makeup for Freddy, I think, really holds it back as well. In the original series, the makeup allowed for Englund to pull out these expressions that can look really cool and menacing. I don't know what it is about the makeup they used here, but it feels too damn limiting. Like, Haley's kind of stuck doing the same face for most of the movie, and it's just another thing that makes this Freddy a little less fun to watch. For the most part, it's fine because the movie primarily showcases him in shadows and dark lighting, but whenever you do see his face, it just throws me off a bit. The story also tries to take a few liberties when it comes to the lore behind Krueger. Remember earlier when I said it felt like the story wanted to take certain leaps but didn't go all the way? Yeah, this is what I was referring to. In the movie, they toy around with the idea that Krueger was innocent all along, and the parents wrongfully accused and killed him. This is a problem in the movie because everything is telling you that's clearly not the case, and the teens who bring this idea forward are fucking idiots. But it ultimately ends up going nowhere with them finding out Krueger did in fact molest them. A lot of people have taken issue with this, saying that humanizing Krueger would have made him less scary, but in my opinion, I would have preferred them going all the way with it. There's definitely a version of this story that could be told with having Krueger, while probably having a few screws loose, was an innocent man who was close with the neighborhood kids, and through one misunderstanding or another gets burned by the parents, and in a fit of psychotic rage, vows to come back for their kids in their dreams. There's definitely a way they could have done that, and I honestly would have encouraged it, because it would have given this movie some much needed originality and uniqueness. I'd rather a remake try to do something different and unique than to stay hooked onto stuff we've already seen and done before. Haley himself is doing a fine job with what he's given, but he still feels like a bit of a lackluster Krueger in my opinion. The other actors didn't do that memorable of a job either, if I'm being honest. The entire cast is star-studded with a lot of well-known folks, but unfortunately most of them feel like they're phoning it in. Rooney Mara really wasn't that impressive as Nancy. She honestly brings nothing to the character with her performance. This is the first movie I ever saw Kyle Gallner in, and while I love him in other stuff, this shit right here I didn't think he was good at all. Clancy Brown and Cotton Britton were okay as Kyle Gallner and Nancy's parents. The only one of the cast other than Haley as Freddy that I think did a memorable job was Katie Cassidy, who played Chris. She actually felt like she was trying compared to most of the other folks here. The kills and effects quality is kinda all over the goddamn place. There are some good looking gore effects and kills, but I think the movie is too reliant on visual effects some of the time. And a lot of the nightmares and dream sequences, they get real creative with some of the transitions and visuals and stuff, which look nice, but other times... it looks like dog shit. The kills themselves, while looking alright, are lacking some real kind of creativity. They recreate Tina's death, except it's a bit more intense with him slamming her around a bunch. Then you have some decent looking stabs. The next slice in the opening was gnarly as fuck. There's nothing that really feels unique and tied to this movie specifically. Like, there's nothing that really sticks out from this movie to where I can say, oh, this kill from the remake is one of the best of the series. There really isn't anything like that, so it just feels okay, I guess. Well, scratch that. The mirror bit with Nancy's mom looks pretty cool. That's kinda it. Overall, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 is a giant disappointment. It pales in so many ways to the original, it's not even funny. It has an incredibly boring cast of characters who are all performed very poorly. Krueger, while effective for the most part, is lacking the charm from the previous films that make them fun to watch. The movie's approach to scares and horror feels so cheap and artificial some of the time, with them rarely allowing for tension and suspense to build naturally, and just jumping to using easy tricks to get the audience scared. The VFX and kill quality are very inconsistent. The writing of the overall script just didn't feel as well thought out or executed. It has a lot of weird holes in certain places that kind of makes the experience a little distracting. And as a whole, for me, just provided a worse way to experience the Nightmare on Elm Street story. This movie, when it comes down to it, is just a very poor recreation of an absolute classic. It would have worked out better, at least for me personally, had they tried to bring a more original experience to the story, like that of the Evil Dead or Friday the 13th remakes. Yeah, Nightmare 2010 was just a giant letdown.
So, with all that said, if you agree or disagree with anything I've said in this video, let me know right down there in the comments below. Also, be sure to like and subscribe. This has been Darion GNB, and take care.